Thank you very much, Luca's tremendous lecture was very impressive. And thank you to DELTALAB for inviting us, and thank you for Adnan for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought I would like to just mention a bit of my background, my professional sort of background, being an architect and planner, because it perhaps also says something about the planning situation in Norway as such. After qualifying in Cardiff, coming back as an architect and a town planner, I worked in a smaller town called Skien, about 50,000 inhabitants. And my main work was to prepare conservation plans and area improvement programs for 5 working class housing areas. I think one of my proudest moments was when I was invited into a small house, 50 square meters footprint, 1.5 floor, where the teenage son usually slept in the grandmother's sitting room upstairs. And they had been building an extension, having had 2 separate bathrooms in, and they removed the cover on their new settee and gave me a cup of coffee and were so happy of the increased livability they'd had through a cooperation we had with the National Housing Bank with free architectural advice and so on to the people wanting to apply for grants. I'll never regret that. Some years later, we moved to Alta, which is far up north. And Alta had, about 8 years before, had a big national civil disobedience campaign, a very huge, sort of deep-reaching protest action where federal government sent in police and a lot of people were arrested because the protest was against a hydroelectric power station along one of the most famous salmon rivers in the country. And they lost, and the hydroelectric power station was constructed, decided by the, at the time, Minister of Environment, Gro Harlem Brundtland, you know the name, the lady with the Our Common Future book in '89. And some years later, she said that was a mistake, building that hydroelectric power station. The effect of this project was that the environmental impact legal framework of Norway changed completely, and we had to work completely differently afterwards. And also the Lap Parliament was established. The Lap Sami people are a majority, indigenous majority. And I remember when I worked there, 8 years after this big, I think 20 years of struggle, we were trying to include quite, I don't know, 500 sites for cottages close to this river. And I negotiated with 15 male leaders of the Lap districts. They all turned up in the national costumes, and they didn't want to speak Norwegian, so I needed to have an interpreter with me. I never experienced that in Norway before. And we did actually get to some solution, not the number we had hoped for, but anyway. Very much a matter of lack of trust or trust. And then some years later, in a sort of liberal sphere, federal government wanted to do away with a code in the planning and building law related to architectural quality and aesthetics. And together with 2 colleagues, the government had sort of said, no, we want to do away with this. And then the parliament member, the opposition in a way, said, no, we need these kind of rules. Together with 2 colleagues, I myself also was invited. I think we had a weekend and 1 workday to propose 5 different alterations of the planning law to get, to strengthen the existing code that was there. And of course for the bureaucrats in parliament or in federal government, it was unusual that the parliament actually passed legal text without any pre-written explanations or explorations and so on. And afterwards, I was invited by 2 ministries to write a 180-page book on guiding how local authorities could improve the architectural quality. And afterwards, because some of this work was done together with a lawyer, we traveled Norway around and we had educational programs for bureaucrats and politicians, I think about 1,000 of them, throughout the country, discussing and talking and telling them about this new legal situation, that the potential they had. And then came Oslo, 20 years as the chief town planner. I think there were 4 things I always say that we did. We got a new comprehensive development plan with quite, I would say, quite modern codes on how to secure environmental aspects and sun and light and different things. We hadn't had a comprehensive development plan, not a legally binding one, for 3 generations almost, I think. We also worked with area improvement programs in the fringe city. I'll show you a picture of it later, where the less affluent people live. And we worked with revising a huge zoning plan for about 29,000 properties of bungalows. And for many years there's been a lot of struggle and it's not finished yet. And the last aspect we worked with was the fjord city, which is what I'm going to tell you about. Here you see what we call the barcode row, and if I'm not wrong, I think Adnan can show you afterwards which of these buildings he's been working on. So, I'll say a bit about the background of Oslo, then I'll go on to talk about the fjord city development. I will also mention to you other types of strategic programs we have used, and then there's some final conclusionary points. To the left here, you see the light yellow picture is the palace, and you see the brown building with 2 towers, that's the city hall, and to the right is the sort of 16th or rather 17th century fortress. So in a way you have the whole history in one picture here. We always, or for quite a while, we said Oslo is the blue and the green and the city in between. It's about a bit more than 0.7 million inhabitants, a third of them being immigrants, and the eastern parts of the city, you can see that to the right, is less affluent than the western side. It's quite a readable sort of difference of social equality or not in the city. I think we are strong on maritime enterprises, for instance, medical research, education, and a lot of administration and ministries, of course. And the fringe city has post-war housing estates like many European cities. Of course, Norway was heavily bombed by, in the Second World War by the Germans. There was a lot of sort of rebuilding and a sort of new modernity approach reaching the city. 9 kilometers of seashore, and for instance, to the left, you see there are sort of 3 islands with about 600 recreational cottages. And the reason why I mention this is that the trade unions towards the end of the 19th century, when the rich people built their summer cottages or houses or palaces almost along the top of the hills, these trade unions built tiny cottages, sort of 15 to 30 square meters on these islands, 600 of them. It took us 20 years to rezone it, but it's a very sort of, now of course it's quite an exclusive ability for people to spend time there, but we've clarified all the seashore, public passages and so on are available on these islands. And of course the goal for our urban development is to better our living conditions and to create more just and climate-friendly city structures. Of course, architecture don't make people happy, but architecture may people have the possibility of becoming happy. You see here some of the projects that have been done along the seafront of the fjord city. I'll mention some of these later. They are both temporary ones and permanent ones. And we have, as you may already have understood, renewed quite a lot of the planning framework that we have. And for instance, the comprehensive development plan is now, the two pictures to the right are now the more recent ones that are being prepared. For 16 years, I worked for a Tory Liberal government, and for 5 years for a Red-Green government. And in many ways, I think the politicians have been quite good. For instance, in '99, when there was a local election, the Tory and the Liberal Party made a choice of pointing to the fjord city, and they sort of pointed to the stars and said, we would like this. And of course, the result is not actually that, but it's that. But if they hadn't pointed up there, they wouldn't have had that either. So this sort of political handwork of actually choosing something and having a common vision about it and pointing at it and perhaps even losing your electorate on it, I think is something I would like to mention about the politicians in Oslo. Of course, a lot of this work was based on close cooperation between planning departments of different kinds and the politicians. And then, of course, the question is, what kind of societal model are we actually working for? Degrowth is sort of the slogan of our times. And to the right, top and bottom, you see, of course, Gate Raworth donut economy, which you know. And to the right bottom, you see how Norway is doing when it comes to use of resources. It's not very impressive. We are overusing a lot of resources. But then, of course, the question is, does this become a strategy for the elite, for the Green Party members, for the people that can buy electrical bicycles like myself, and so on? And do you get the yellow vests like in Paris from heading these policies very strongly? I think all people will always want to work to improve their own living conditions, but so perhaps degrowth is perhaps a wrong concept. Perhaps it's more about, of course, growing less, but growing better and choosing better manners of growing. Oslo has for quite a while wanted to be a sort of initiating climate city. We were the green capital of Europe in 2019. And we've been sharing, or we've been benchmarking and sharing knowledge for quite a while. At the moment, we are heading a C40 network on climate budgeting. I think it was in 2016, the city started preparing climate budgets simultaneously with the financial budget. And instead of forecasting, backcasting what should be done today in order to reach some goal in a given period of time in the future. And now this has been taken on, I think, in many parts of the world. For instance, all the public infrastructure projects that are being carried out have now to be carried out by fossil-free machineries by the contractors. So in a way, having the role of ordering quite big commissions also influences the industry as such. Yeah. Have you heard about the Danish model called Local Authority 3.0? People came after the war quite modestly to the local authority and said, could I have 10 poles or planks to build a garage? In the 1980s, you had some public participation, perhaps especially related to health services, and old age pensioners were able to say what they'd like to have of services, but it was always the city who decided. And now we're into this co-creation period where perhaps the young generation, your generation, doesn't accept to be told what type of services they should have. For instance, when we did the car-free livability program that I'll mention to you later, we had this project about sort of allotment gardens coming up, and in the end the city employed a city farmer who works with some of these spaces. And whether it is an art project like the one in the middle, temporary art project, or it is a soap bubble festival that somebody has arranged, in a way one has to allow, I think, and that may be difficult for the planning department, and it may especially be difficult for the roads department to accept that these spaces have to be opened up for different types of activities. Of course, the urban development in Oslo is based on digital mapping and analysis. We often use planning briefs with doing an analysis of existing qualities, future needs, and feasibility studies with a kind of urban concept. Some years ago, the planning laws chapter on environmental impact analysis was given what the ministry calls the Oslo Code, which is where we said we want to have some kind of concept drawing very early on, and that is now included in the legal framework. A lot of the projects that are being carried out are private. A lot of these housing projects in Bjørvika that you see here are done privately. And of course, the city has quite a few or more sort of strategic projects or federal bodies. And quite often some big projects, like in this case, a big underwater tunnel was built to do away with grey infrastructure on land that allowed the city to be opened up like this. I did take, I won't go through it very much in detail, but in Denmark there is a sort of public benefit fund, Realderna, who gives money to different types of publicly important projects. We have just a small fund in Norway for that, but they have made a model on what type of strategic cooperation could you have in urban development, and I just mentioned them briefly. One is the facilitator model, the other is the interest body model, the third one is having an enterprise model, and the last one is ownership model. And of course, I think you can understand, you can read this afterwards, you can understand that going from top to bottom either decreases or increases the influence that the city has. And the comments here as well show that you may not, in the facilitator model, when you work in partnership with somebody, you may not have a very strong legal framework, but if you do the partnership well, and if you in addition add some money to the work, then you can actually achieve quite a lot of results. I think in Norway, or in Oslo, we probably used the three first ones in different types of combinations. The city has sold us most of its land, so we don't have very much of an ownership model. If we have an ownership model, it is in some of the more deprived areas where we will go to a developer and say, we want this area to be, or not one developer, but several developers, and say, we want this area to be renewed, and we will chip in with the new schools and so on, social infrastructure that is needed. The enterprise model, where you actually create a communal company between some landowners and the city for the development, but not implementation of the land projects. I think what we have there is what we called planning briefs and planning obligations, I think it's called in the English planning law, where the city early on sort of describes what type of services and structure and facilities they want, and then as the zoning process goes on, you make an agreement with the developer about what type of contribution they should do, either by building physical things or by putting money into a fund that is being used for developing the area. And to the right, you just see what type of time scale you can use these different models for. Here is it all, it's all in English, in Danish, so you can look at it afterwards. As I said, our local authority has often sold us most of our land. owner occupation or shared communal dwellings, sort of housing associations, or boligsamvirke that we call it, with some type of shared ownership is most usual. We don't really have, we do, I think Oslo has 11,000 dwellings for the very poor people, but we don't have a lot of affordable housing. We don't really have a proper funding system for affordable housing, I must admit. We could talk a lot about that. A lot of other countries have that handled much better than us. But the local authority, if we have a sort of urgency in a project, then we will do the facilitating role and the interest role. And in some areas, I'll show you one, the city may have a sort of leading role in drawing all the development through doing infrastructure. I talked about the planning obligations and the urban contracts that we have used also in Bjørvika. You'll see more about that afterwards. And I mentioned that the ownership model is not that usual for us. I'll show you now 3 different models, the operational use of these models. One is Ensjø, a sort of typical warehousing area, post-war warehousing area. You see some key factors at the top text here. We made a very simple planning brief very early on, and I think our commissioner said, from car city to housing city, fra bil til boligby. We made all the zoning plans for the blue, green and technical infrastructure, and then private developers had the housing projects. But our property agency in the city, not a planning department, although we cooperated about this, invited property owners to participate in a cooperation project. And the private developers also joined forces, so they had a bit better sort of role execution when they negotiated with the city. And it was interesting that in this case, this was about 25 years ago, then the developer said, could you, the city, please carry out the infrastructure? That was probably mostly or partly because the added value taxation that goes into any project is refunded if it's a public project, but it's not refunded if it's a private project. In this process, we often make the framework plan for the public spaces. Here is another area. I use this often because you can see there are some pink squares or something there, which shows there should be a 400 square meters square. This is not a legally binding plan, it's a framework plan. And the space, the square may come out in quite a different shape, but it's then sort of identified as an important infrastructure element that has to be carried out. And if you look at the 2 gray columns in the middle here, that is describing 2 different quality norms, one normal norm and one high norm, for different aspects, for instance, a street, playground, a park, or whatever. And the planning department and the property department sort of decides what are the most important. Of course, we never get all the money you want for these kind of things, so we have to give priority. The 10 most important aspects for this development are that, that, and that. So this public space structure, which in many ways is the urban concept, really, is being done early on. We have the differentiated quality norms, as I said, and this is the basis for individual zoning plans prepared by the developers afterwards. The property department does the cost analysis of all this infrastructure, and that is a basis for negotiating the planning obligations between the city and the developers. I think this functions really well, and it makes sure that the projects are actually being carried out when the plan is approved by the city council. But I will not hide the fact that there are quite a lot of struggle between the city and the property developers. And there have been court cases as well, because the model may seem easiest when you are building on green land, but we use it very much in the existing city as well. And then there's often a struggle about, well, can you really ask for a bicycle lane 5 blocks away and so on. But I think the model has come to stay, so to speak. And in this one project I showed you, I think the city has carried out about 50 different projects. And the plans were about as detailed or rough as you see them on the right-hand side. But the intention was very clear. So the planning document is quite flexible, but the intention is clear. And here you can see some of the results. To the right, you see the drawings that we made, one for the blue and green structure, one for density and the height of the buildings, and to the right, the different types of land use allocations. The pictures to the west show the sort of brownish housing project is in that red square, which is the sort of public transport node. And you see the brook that has been reopened through one of these green corridors. And of course, there's a school with an adjacent water pond next to it. So these set of plans, which I must say, federal government bodies don't like them because they like formal plans that they can protest formally against. But we sort of say you really have to participate in these processes early on. And it creates some sort of discussion about what type of detailing should these plans have and what type of transport analysis and so on should you have. But I think it actually functioned quite well. I just showed you this picture. In the middle, a reused office headquarters that has been turned into housing, a bit like Lacaton and Vassal projects, I think. And we kept some historic monuments, but the 2 steel sheds to the right we have pulled down, and today I think we probably wouldn't have done that. Okay, then to the Fjord City model. 40 years of transformation from very much technical infrastructure. I guess this could even have been a part of Luke's lecture on the role of infrastructure. With the train running across the City Hall Square, 8 motorway lanes across the same square, and a flyover that was demolished in 2012, only 20-25 years after the civil engineers designed this flyover. And of course that is quite something, because for the professional sort of mindset to change when people are still active in the profession is quite demanding. And the goal of the Fjord City was to give the fjord back to the people. 9 kilometers of harbour promenade and 13 commons. You know the English word commons, don't you? Sort of public space that belongs. And you always have them in any tiny village, you will have a common. And of course it was to open up the city from behind towards the fjord. We had a long discussion with the historic monuments officer at federal level, because they were very strict on landfill. We weren't allowed, if we were to have some landfill, we would have to dig out something else along the coast, and we did. Let's see. This area is to the left here, the one I'm going to show you first, Tjuvholmen. The city and the harbour authorities had been in a long struggle about who actually owns this seashore. And I think, of course, it's the city, because it's the city that has created the sort of prosperity and so on of this location. But the harbour authorities meant the opposite. And then at the time, conservative city government decided either we can spend 10 years in legal struggle, or we say to the harbour authorities, you can sell some of this land and use it to compact your own land consumption and renew the harbour activities, modernize the harbour activities. And in this case, the Oslo Harbour was able to sell this through a project competition, quite an extraordinary one, because everyone that participated had to have a bank guarantee of 500 million euro in order to participate. Of course, a lot of developers and architects couldn't.
The architects and engineers were part of developer teams.
Yeah.
Even contractors.
Yes. very special. And it did even almost ended up in a legal court case between the first and the second prize. But and it was supposed to have 2 destinations. In the end, you can see the building with the white roof. That is Renzo Piano private museum. So we only got 1 destination. All the public spaces and communal spaces are built and managed by the developers. But we did have a legally binding quality program that I think was important as it was part of the zoning process. Or even the sales contract from the harbour authorities to the developer had some design requirements in it. At one summer, 2015, it was a very hot summer, and you see the jetty at the bottom of the photograph there. Lots of people. I mean, we'd been promising people that they could reach the fjord, and we'd been promising that for 20 years almost. Everybody went to the jetty to have a bathing session, and then the caretaker of this housing estate, this is about the most expensive one in Oslo, they fenced it all off and said you can't come. And of course it was an uproar, and we in the planning department had to write a letter saying that this is zoned as a public space and everybody can come, adding though that the police code says that there should not be disturbing noise after 11 o'clock at night. And afterwards, my political commissioner, I think quite a sensible Tory fellow, he said, Ellen, whenever it is an important public space, it has to be zoned as a public space. I never thought I'd get that from a Tory politician. And then I move on to the Bjørvika model. You saw an illustration of that earlier. Perhaps the biggest zoning plan prepared in Norway ever, I think 1 million square meters floor space. That was much more a partnership-led and headed by us in the city. And we had a project sort of management group in the planning department with the property owners. A lot of them were public companies, just to say that, sort of railroad company or the roads company or whatever. But there was one more well-known private developer as well. And we had yearly communal planning programs with budgets, and we sort of at the beginning of the year decided which part is going to head each of these different planning tasks. And we did have a sort of parallel commission before we started drawing anything to sort of explore what type of programming should we put into the zoning plan when we sent it to City Hall to give us a commission back. We had quite strict rules on that required zoning on all green and technical and social infrastructure, in addition to all the built spaces, of course. And for many years, I think 6 or 7 years, we had regular meetings with the developers, my people every fortnight. I might have it every month or every other month, which meant that we always discussed all the projects before they were forwarded formally. We never actually formally refused anything. We may send a lot of the projects back, for instance, the barcode row of these high buildings. I think all of them were politely saying to the architects or the developers rather, please, could you alter this a bit and that a bit. So we never had to refuse anything, but we had very clear sort of opinions about what we wanted to happen. And the developers in this area had what is called Bjørvika development or Bjørvika infrastructure, because the city didn't want to take the risk of building all these streets and parks and so on. Except for the parade street running at Fjellmannsgate, which is a federal sort of street because it has to be an extra transport route if the tunnel stops. Everything was built by the developers, but and finance. Yes, I'm going to say that as well. Afterwards, all these spaces were given back to the city for management now, as opposed to the previous project, where it's all still kept in private ownership, although it is owned, a lot of it is owned publicly. There was a sort of clear legal framework with a set of urban contracts in advance, and we had a lot of, I think we had 9 negotiating processes with the Federal Historic Monuments Officer, for instance, related to these visual accesses through the structure. And this took quite a long time, but the interesting thing was that before any contracts were signed, one decided on how the jobs should be divided, not who was going to do the job, because then you'll have all the positioning and all the struggle between the bodies involved, but how is it rational to divide these technical infrastructure jobs? And afterwards, one shared between the parties involved the different tasks. And the urban concept of Bjørvika was, I normally say, a hand with 7 fingers, 7 commons and a harbor, the sort of sea being here, and all these commons coming in. And the harbor promenade was, of course, very, oh yes, I've forgotten to write, a harbor promenade being the gifts to the city. The dwellings here are not cheap, and that is a sort of complaint, rightly so, I think, about this area. But the public spaces, they are not cheap. They were cheaper, but not cheap. And now they're more expensive. But the access to the seafront was the most important. After the zoning plan was approved in 2004, we thought, what is the most important thing to sort of focus on now? And we made this international competition for the public spaces. It was SLA Architects with Francisca. And Jan Gehl, who won this competition. We were harassed by some of the senior private practicing architects saying, what the hell, why are you focusing on the public space? And we said, that is the most important public interest. And the interesting thing, I think, was that for many years after the developers, although different property owners bought different parts of the area, a lot of the professional competence that was created through this competition, that is the consultants that won and so on, were used for many years. And I think that gave a sort of strength and a direction and an intention that was quite good for the area. We had a long-term focused effort on this. You see to the left a zoning plan. We had a sustainability program for aesthetics, culture, and environment. And the light blue picture to the top right is the competition. And then there was, of course, the zoning plan for each public space. No public space was actually being built without the zoning. And 10 years after, the river, the most important river of Oslo's 10 rivers, was dug up and opened up 2 blocks all the way into the railway lines. And of course, the commons bring people to the seafront in different manners. This sort of station common that we built, I think is great to see people sort of move about. Also, you have civic society elements or initiatives coming, like there's somebody renting out these old wooden boats along the seafront. And I think to the left you see quite a green space, but I think perhaps what we would have more focus on in the future is the marine life as well. So what we did, in fact, was that a public space structure we stuck to very strictly. It was designed very early on, before any landscape architects came in, and we stuck to the actual footprint of the public space. But there did, of course, happen refinements and some changes. For instance, a wet space to the left should have been dug open, but because the Historic Monuments Officer wanted an old stone wall kept, we said, okay, let's use these fountains instead. And of course, as years passed, the spaces were refined in different matters. And of course, Jan Gehl's concept of I call it the value of excellence, herlighetsverdier, is important. And you should give it to the citizens temporarily while the area is maturing, but of course also finally. And for instance, to the left here, with the new opera in the background by Snøhetta, as soon as the harbor authorities moved the fences 4 meters back, people just sort of it's like a flood of people sort of entering these spaces. And to the right, you see the more permanent ones with Vannkunstens housing project. I'd like to sort of mention that with these commons, and this one was designed as a green common, and you shouldn't allow buildings there. But then we had a code saying in the zoning plan that there should be art in this area. Quite a wise board of the Harbour Property Agency decided to allocate 2 million euros for art project, and then they contracted a very energetic curator, I would say, Anne Beate Hovin, and they came with this proposal for a bakery house. And of course, legally speaking, it's not allowed to build buildings in a green space. But then we had to think, what is the intention behind this? And does that adhere to the plan? And of course, it was to grow vegetables, to use them, to make different types of sort of medieval grain bread and so on. So of course it sort of supported the intention of the plan. I just mentioned, I won't say a lot about it. New types of buildings and public spaces, for instance, vertical use of surfaces. I think it was the first plan we had with demanding green roofs of different types of 50% of all the buildings in the area. And we also had codes requiring different types of activities, for instance, indoor commons. I think it's great that Snøhetta designed the opera that you can walk along and see them work on the different equipment for the activities inside. And to the right, we had required 400 square meters, and the developer came and said, could I please make a sculpture park outside and drop this inside space? And I said, please do the sculpture park, but we have to keep the 400 square meters. Now, the Norwegian Tourist Association, which is normally about hiking in the mountains, created their first free air house in the middle of the capital through this zoning activity. And there's even I saw Luca had a picture of a yoga thing. I don't know whether it's appropriate to connect it really, but you have a nursery, children's nursery, and you have yoga classes, and you have paddling courses and so on. But of course, the housing itself, I think is beautiful. I wanted to move there. I didn't manage to convince my husband to move there. And as time passed, we didn't have the money either. But is it accessible to all? And I think the spaces are to the top right. You see my husband and my 2 grandchildren enjoying the waterfront. And of course, the bathing and the sauna supplies along the coast have become more and more important. And to me, the jumping of scales between the structure plan, you can have as many nice words as you like, but if you don't actually carry the intentions down to the zoning plan and then to the building permission, they are not worth anything. And here a lot of good professional landscapes architects and architects have worked. You see there's an orange container tower. In the beginning it was actually a civil society demand, do make a temporary harbour promenade. And as time went by, I think we were 6 different departments in the city that worked together for 6 years. Created these towers that showed the history, that showed some comic series from the 60s when the containers came to Oslo, and showed the future of what it was going to be. And to me, of course, it's the connection between everything that's important. It's the spaces in between and the connection between them. And to the left bottom, it doesn't matter where it is, but it's in Denmark. And sometimes these urban development, redevelopment projects become too much their own thing. And to us, it's been important to create an urban fabric that is actually a connected urban carpet in a way. And we have built a new Munch museum with different types of important exhibitions. What's the name again? Trace Emin, thank you, Adnan, with her sort of polluted bed. First time out of London in 10 years, came to the opening here. Polluted, I mean, lived in bed, came here. It was a lot of discussion about this, lot of protests, lot of actions, lot of political strife and so on, but now it's built. And of course, in the end, I guess it's about how we live. Tracy Emin made a sculpture to the right. Her mother died earlier, as did Edvard Munch's mother. I'll quickly run through the use of other strategic programs. First of all, waterways and nature-based systems. Ever since 1949, after the war, Oslo has had its park plan where the 10 rivers have been structuring the urban development, and more so the last couple of decades. Buying up the banks along the rivers, opening them up for recreational purposes, and so on. And of course, it was quite surprising for us that this sauna activity became a very big activity as the fjord city developed. To the left is an art project from 2009 along the Alna River, where we invited, together with the schools and immigrant groups, for the women to exhibit their most valuable piece of cloth or whatever it was from their own homeland. And you can see there are technical interventions being done so that you can walk through and along these rivers. And of course, the NBS is about working with, not against nature, and not just including nature, but working on nature's technology basis. For instance, this park, which is along one of these rivers, the phytomediation or the biological purification was very important. By using willow plants, they purified the polluted ground within 2 to 3 years. So instead of using big lorries to transport the polluted ground to a new environmental problem depot, it was all purified here. And this kind of work, I think we have to work a lot more with in the future. And of course, we have often destroyed nature, and we have to do things related to extreme weather and so on. And for instance, the picture in the middle, the harbor authorities did a huge job in clearing the ground underwater of the whole harbor, a lot of polluted ground. That was also quite a dramatic and disputed process. But what they did was they put back these artificial reefs in concrete, and the Natural Science University have done research on this to see whether the marine life actually comes back, and it does. And the latest architectural competition, which is on the eastern side of Bjørvika, one has really gone into looking at not only beautiful things above land, but beautiful things that could be created underwater as well. And it's about architecture on stilts, I would say. You can see two proposals here, Grønlikaia and a sauna village in Bjørvika, where what is happening underneath is as important as above sea level. And I just quickly wrote down some of the principles that, for instance, the jury of this architectural competition has said. How can land-based organisms move from land to sea? How can you make ecological steps, also using buildings with short distances between the ecological biotopes? How can you use external surfaces designed for marine growth? And the photosynthetic water level between 0 and -3 meters is the most suitable for this type of growth. If the surfaces are perforated, it gives better possibilities for the organisms to hide. And of course, sloping surfaces that achieve sun also is much better for marine growth. Another element, I think a lot of cities have perhaps quite good street designs within the city center. Not always, but quite often. But we often have all these sort of highways running out of the city. And when the city then is redeveloped, you know, sort of brown and gray areas being redeveloped, we often keep these highway-like roads. And for some years we worked on, for instance, this road running out of Oslo, Østre Akervei, of how we could remodel it into an urban boulevard. And in the beginning, the Federal Roads Department said, no, no, it's not possible. But after some years, they said, okay, perhaps we could build it as, or remodel it as a 60 kilometers an hour road, where you can even have pedestrian crossings in plane, at street level. You can plant the trees, make it a urban character. So we call it From Roads to Street program. And when we did the rezoning of all the streets in the city center, we used Rueda's, what's his name, Rafael Rueda, the biologist from Barcelona, who's made the superblocks. We used that concept in the streets, and we say that half the section of the street should be used for city life or vegetation or green mobility in different ways. It's really sort of turning our heads around what normally has been put as most important, the accessibility for the car. We had, I think I mentioned to somebody that Oslo is like any city, a lot of division between the different departments. And at one stage, I said to the head of the roads department, what is our common task? It's actually to renew and improve the city floor. And we made this action program to the right for improved livability in the streets. And then we had the red-green government coming in, and they were very keen on what they call the car-free livability program. And I think you will see, you'll be told about these projects afterwards. For instance, from Francisco, for instance, this summer street that has been creating temporarily. Of course, if you do it for only 2 years, then you don't need a rezoning. So you can use a sort of testbed approach at the beginning of these projects. There are some challenges with that as well, but I think Francisco will tell you about that. And it was very much about turning the transport hierarchy on its head. And we experienced very much a change of language and new groups that came into the discussion. Young people, they sort of felt free to demand to use a piece of a street for an exchange of Toys Day, for instance, or a film festival or whatever. And I mentioned this Municipality 3.0, where the co-creation phase is where we have to move into more and more, I think. And the strategies we used in the car-free livability program was, of course, the co-creation, get most of the parties involved. Of course, a lot of the trade people were very skeptical, but I think the National Enterprise Board realized that city centers are perhaps less and less trade and more services, you know, eating, entertainment.
When you say trade, it's shop owners, basically.
Yes, quite. We did use a sort of strategy for short-term initiatives, but they should all add to a long-term, implementing a long-term strategy. We developed existing pilots when they had been there for a year or two. We moved on to making them more lasting. And here is Salvador Rueda is his name. His picture of what we often actually experience as pedestrians when we move in the city. There's hardly any space for the pedestrians.
In Rijeka, this is literally the photo.
And we did some surveys at 2 different phases in this program. I headed it for 3 years, and it lasted for those 3 years. But now they're carrying on with this action program that lasts 10 years anyway. And you see that half of the people said that they would like more car-free areas, and they would like more car-free areas outside the city center as well. And they would even like to drive less in order to reach the climate goals. At the same time, a quarter, you can see, are against this. But I remember when our commissioner said after some debate during the Green Capital Year with one of the more well-known property owners in the city centre, she said, perhaps we were a bit strict when we said car-free. And then he said, no, you scared the shit out of us, but then we realized that you meant it seriously. So actually stating it quite strongly, and of course in the end it had to be sort of emergency vehicles, and it had to be parking for service vehicles and for handicapped people and so on. So it wasn't going to be car-free, but the message you gave was quite important. And when we then forwarded the zoning plan, I showed you the section before, I thought that was on New Year's Eve in 2018, the national newspaper said this is a good basis for development of the city centre, and then I thought, yes, now we've done it. Also working with pilot programs. I think you've done it with a cultural year, you had European Cultural Year and so on. The URBAC program based in Holland was a program where we worked with 5 bigger developers in the urban sprawl of the fringe city area. And then, of course, these 2 projects, the Munch Museum and this vertical Nydalen, are sort of one-to-one pilot. I think Oslo has about 5 pilot projects like this now, on halving the energy consumption and doing different types of experimental work, like the building to the right doesn't have artificial air conditioning. It just has tall ceilings. What's his name again? I asked somebody. Elbe? No, what's his name? The Austrian architect.
Eberle.
Yeah, Eberle. So that was a good cooperation between the city, this organization that does this future built, it's called, and the city.
And this program is also now being taken over by other cities in Norway. It started in Oslo locally, but it's now
in Bergen and yeah, there were 3 local authorities in Oslo and 3 around, and now there's 5, and it's gone to Bergen, and I think also Stavanger is on this way. And of course, these area improvement programs are important in some of the deprived areas. Like to the left, it's a youth library where adults are not allowed to come in, and where you have to take your shoes off by the door because it affects how people act. I think both girls and boys learn to cook and different things here. It's very popular. And of course, the new city library that you may see when you come to Oslo has become a tremendously popular space, especially for immigrant girls, because this is a space which is safe to go to and to stay in. It's probably the same in the library here in Rijeka as well, I think. We use architectural competitions a lot to create new narratives. For instance, this fringe city area full of railroads and motorways and electric lines and so on. We used it, and we've used this the years to come afterwards when we make more formal planning briefs and so on. I also think it's important that the local authority must request quality clearly, and when we do have different norms that the developers don't always like, not even the architects, I don't think, but it's a way of putting the agenda for what you should debate in a project, I think. The blue one, second to the left, is the first one we made, where we made a norm for how much public space, or communal space, sorry, there should be within each project. And the green-blue one to the right is the last one I signed about the fringe zone between the street and the facade of buildings before I left. And we have different ones. And as I implied earlier, to closely follow up from structure plan to zoning plan is important. If you look at the bottom here, you can see the structure of this public common, which is narrower on the left-hand side, and then it comes wider and wider. That was inspired by Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, which I visited in the 1980s. And of course, it makes the buildings at the back get an access to the seafront as well. And then I think the third learning point is the feasibility-seeking public bodies. If you join up with civic society, it gives a kind of diversity that cannot be foreseen either by the city or by the civic society, which I think is a sort of valuable little sweet one should always keep in mind to lift the projects even further. To clarify the public space structure early, both the temporary and the permanent ones, I mentioned that. And if I look back on all this together, I think from the Second World War or even before, we had a master plan. Then we moved into a phase of only strategic plan. And I guess then we have moved back to a flexible master plan. Remember the division between the public structure and the flexibility of the building plots. And now we're also then into the partnership with planning obligation and action programs involved. So that's what I was going to say to you. Thank you.